Hi, everyone. Welcome back along to the show. Today, I have with me Marcus Grazette. He is the public policy lead at Holistic AI, and he's come onto the show to talk about the societal impact of technology and the approach to setting policy to put some guardrails in place and to help the societal impact be a positive one, hopefully, and not a negative one. So, Marcus, welcome along to the show. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Jason. It's great to be here.
No. Well, it's great to have this topic of conversation. I'm a bit of a fan of talking about societal impact of stuff, and technology is such an influential and impactful thing that it certainly doesn't have an impact from business to your kids to your grandparents, right? So brilliant to have you on the show. Do you want to just get us going with introducing a little bit about you, your background, and how you ended up in public policy?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm currently, as you said, at Holistic AI. We're a very small company that spun out of UCL a couple of years ago, really to work on data ethics and ethical and responsible use of AI in business, like you said.
Yeah.
I've also basically spent my whole career working on different kinds of public policy problems. So I started off in central government. I was at the Foreign Office for about 10 years, working on foreign policy issues and trying to think about how we as the UK could address those. And then I decided that I wanted to shift and work more on technology issues. So I spent a couple of years at a software company, which was developing privacy enhancing technologies. So the GDPR in 2018 drove a lot of businesses to want to use data in a privacy preserving way. And the company I was working for delivered technology that helped organizations to do that.
Right.
And then I spent some time at the ICO trying to look at the problem from the other side of the fence. So not from the perspective of a business wanting to use data, but from the perspective of a regulator trying to fundamentally protect people from having data about them used in ways that were harmful or unexpected. And then the opportunity came up to join Holistic. I knew one of the co-founders when he was at UCL doing his PhD, and there was an opportunity, so I decided to turn my public policy focus onto the question of AI.
Nice. And it's clearly lots to kick around on the topic of AI and its impact and the policy around it. Very topical as always, but it's a fascinating career journey actually, because being in ethics, in policy, seeing it from the side of sort of business, technology, the regulator themselves, and in government, you've had that real sort of broad breadth of interaction and stakeholders in that topic, right?
Yeah, and I think it has been fascinating to see it from those different perspectives and to try and understand when you're in the ICO, for example, crafting a piece of regulation or a piece of guidance, being able to put yourself in the shoes of the company or, more often the data protection team or the privacy lawyer within a company who's thinking, what the heck am I going to do to make sure that we're sort of demonstrating that we comply with this? And
Yeah.
actually, I think it's quite an interesting thing for people who work in public policy more generally to do, just having that interdisciplinary and kind of cross-sectoral experience as well, to really help make all of the experiences better. So better policy that's more implementable or actionable by business, and also businesses trying to understand that the guardrails are actually carefully thought through and are there to prevent harm. So not getting into this kind of adversarial setting where you see people basically trying to work around them.
And I guess there's a bit of a healthy tension between those different lenses on the topic. There's yes, the need for control, but yes, there's the need for guardrails, but yes, there's a need for commercial benefit in some organizations, and the sort of freedom to innovate. So there's sort of this tension between the need for guardrails, and rightly so, in my view anyway, but also for the kind of flexibility and freedom that people need to innovate and move fast and fix things and add value to the world. So
Absolutely. I think just on the point about that tension, I think that the guardrails often provide opportunity for businesses to actually take that innovation to market, because if you imagine that you had this newfangled product that no one had ever heard of, and people didn't quite understand how it worked, and actually no one was quite sure if it was legal or how to use it properly, you would probably struggle to sell it. Whereas if you were able to show that your product was, it had some safety standard or some accreditation, or it was FDA approved, or whatever the certification or the kind of kite mark is. And actually those are type of guardrail as well. The idea that you have this
sort of a quality standard.
Mark. Yeah, exactly. And that allows you to take your innovative product to market, because if you didn't have that, it's less likely that you would find the kind of mass market opportunity, and also people like investors to come and put money into your company, because they wouldn't be confident they'd be able to actually sell their product legally.
Yeah, that's a really good point. As you say, the positive side is to have that stamp, to have that authority that the thing we've built is responsible or is protected by guardrails. And we've got examples of that. You mentioned about sort of FDA approved. You've got examples in some industries where you physically can't take something to market without having been approved by some kind of regulatory body that says, yes, this meets the standards that we expect, and those standards are defined well and implemented well and hopefully consistently across organizations.
Which can be, they can be quite hard to do. Anyway, sorry,
I'm sure. No. I was going to say we jumped straight into talking about sort of the need for guardrails, and we've got to have policy, but we've sort of gone on the assumptive there. Obviously,
we haven't done the why.
Yeah, exactly. So. And obviously you're from that background, and I'm of the view that it's good, but we should probably explore that a bit. So, so talk to me a bit about why, sort of where policy comes from, why it's needed, and also sort of who. Obviously, you've worked at the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, but who are the key players, actually, the stakeholders that sort of set these policies and standards?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think that there's kind of two drivers really of the need for these guardrails. And I think it comes down to what I was saying just now about creating markets for new and innovative products and services. So how do I, as a consumer, have confidence that the thing that I'm going to use and buy is actually going to work as advertised, and is not going to be harmful to me, or not going to kind of interact with me in a sort of harmful way? And I think so creating that market by creating policies and standards. And I'll give you a really kind of simple example. When I went out of the office today to get some lunch, there was a score on the door of the sandwich place. They have a little food standards agency thing that rates their food hygiene from 1 to 5. And that's an example of a kind of standard which is enforced by the Food Standards Agency, the council. I don't know who actually does the inspections, but by an ecosystem of things like inspection and rules. And that gives me confidence when I walk into their sandwich shop, that if I see that sticker on the door and it's got a high rating, that I can sort of buy some lunch and be pretty confident that it's going to have been prepared properly and all that sort of stuff. So it gives me confidence as a consumer, and it gives the business also the ability to grow their market. And maybe you sort of expect a food place to have a high food standard rating, but it allows me to trust that food establishment. And so there's this dual function around consumer protection, and I think that's a driver for a lot of regulation and policy, particularly in the area of data-driven technologies. And that other flip side of it, which is around creating markets and creating kind of saleable products that actually work and deliver benefits.
So protect the consumer, give confidence to the consumer, but also, I suppose, I'm not sure you use these words, but sort of set the standard for the business that's interacting. And we're talking about technology and data, but set the standard for what good looks like for technology, for data.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And the two things are kind of interconnected, because going back to the food safety example, I might choose a restaurant that has a higher rating because I have confidence that I'll have a better experience there, versus one that has a lower rating. And in standards, you then get these things like kite marks and certifications, where businesses can then demonstrate that they're actually following the standards, or have some external accreditation to show that what they're doing is compliant with those standards. It's a bit harder in data protection. I think one of the challenges with data protection is how do you set the rules without stifling innovation? Because you can't, unlike in your sandwich example, it's very hard in advance to define what good looks like. I mean, you can do that a lot for food hygiene. You can say, oh, do people wash their hands? And, is stuff kept to the right temperature and all that kind of thing. You can almost create a checklist. And if people follow the checklist, what they're doing will be sort of good.
Right. Yeah.
But in the use of data, where there are lots of different kinds of use case that you could imagine, there are lots of different ways in which data can be collected or can be used, lots of different inferences you can make as a result of it, lots of decisions you can make about people as a result of data about them. And it's very hard in advance to say these things are okay and these things are not. And actually, what we've seen in the data protection space, and bringing it back to the ICO a little bit, is certainly that the GDPR is a very principles-based piece of regulation. So the way it's framed is very much about risk and what's proportionate, and risk in the sense of risk of harm to individuals.
Yeah. And as you say, you've got the principles based, or you go the other way, which is very sort of almost draconian and rules based, like the food standards. And I guess there's a tough balance to strike there, isn't there, when you define policy on whether it needs to be principles based, which makes it very broadly implementable across lots of sectors, across lots of countries where there aren't necessarily same cultures and same standards in other things, versus something really specific, like the checklist of things you need to do to get a 5-star in food rating. It should policy be, in your view, be broad so that it's broadly implementable, but at the risk of not being specific and therefore unclear? Or should it be much more kind of laser focused on really specific use cases that much more clearly determine what is right and what is wrong?
Yeah, it's a great question, actually, and one that I think regulators grapple with quite a lot. So I think what you end up with is a kind of lattice structure, almost, where you have some kinds of regulation which are horizontal across the whole economy. And the GDPR is actually a good example of that, where any sector of the economy where you're using personal data, you will have to meet the requirements in GDPR. And that's the kind of horizontal piece of regulation. And then what you also have complementing that is a series of verticals, like, for example, actually, health is quite a good example of this, because you have these verticals and you have lots of different sort of layers within them. Right. So you might have, for instance, the MHRA, which is I'm going to get the acronym wrong now, but the Medicines and Health Regulatory Authority. I think that's what that stands for. Someone can fact check that and put that in the podcast notes. And they will regulate and have very specific requirements that things like medical devices need to follow. And they'll be around standards like, is it safe? Does it actually work? Does it sort of do the thing that it says it should do? So although you're using personal data sometimes to develop these medical devices, which, I mean, a medical device could be some kind of AI-driven, maybe personalized medicine type system. You're using personal data to train and develop that system. So you're following the GDPR requirements as a horizontal requirement, but then you're also following the very specific requirements within the vertical that say, for example, in order to be considered effective, this needs to work, 99.9% of the time, or, it needs to only generate side effects this proportion of the time, that kind of thing. And then you'd have to demonstrate that by providing data on your clinical trials and doing all those sorts of things with the MHRA. And there's similar examples as well in things like banking. There'll be banking supervision regulators that will ensure that any specific use cases that are happening within that sector are also then regulated according to specific standards. Right. And there's one more example, which I just kind of tie that up with, which is we are seeing in an AI context a trend as well towards saying that some use cases are just off the cards. Like, there's some things you just shouldn't do with AI systems. So, for example, the EU's proposed AI Act, which is trundling through the EU legislative process at the moment and due to be hopefully voted in end of 2023, that currently has essentially a prohibition on social scoring. So this idea that you can use sort of mass surveillance and AI technology to do kind of broad social scoring by governments on citizens and use that data to somehow, I don't know, restrict access to things or make decisions about people. And the EU has decided, the European institutions, European Parliament, etc., have decided that social scoring is something that they think is unacceptable and is just outright listed in the legislation as being banned. And that's an example of a specific use case being essentially prescribed. And we're going to say, actually, we don't think that's acceptable. And that's out with the kind of broader principles-based approach that the rest of the legislation would take.
Yeah, nice. So very specific example that fits into the rest of the ecosystem of regulation around the use of data. I guess there's nuance in, what is social scoring and when, in what situations it applied. But yeah, I can see the principle there. I didn't know about that. So that's great to hear because I've had a bit of a, a bit of a Black Mirror challenge.
What was that episode on Black Mirror where people end up with a kind of floating score out of 5?
Yeah, it's across their head. Yeah, and they can't get certain.
The episode.
They can't. Certain Airbnb properties are available to them with certain scores, and they can go on certain trains. That you can see how that can manifest itself. So yeah, I like the idea of that policy. So yeah, we're talking about that sort of the question of broad versus specific, and I guess also back to this idea of who is doing that, who are the key players in defining this and agreeing it. And obviously, probably a broad question globally, but is this arm's length or very independent policy bodies like the ICO? Is this central government? Is this local government? Is this business? Is this actually tech vendors and platforms, which obviously has its own challenges?
Yeah.
Who are the main players and decision makers?
So I think all of the above is the slightly facetious answer.
Yeah, no, I thought it might be.
It's one of those things where you have different actors at different levels of the ecosystem playing a slightly different role. Right. So the AI Act, actually, which I just mentioned, is quite a good example of this because it takes a broad approach of defining principles. So it says things like you must have appropriate governance in place, or the systems must perform to a sort of acceptable standard. And what then happens is that you leave, so the legislator, the Parliament, the European Commission, in a European context, and obviously in a UK context, it would be the UK Parliament and the government who would propose and then sort of pass legislation. And then what happens is you get a more technical layer underneath that, which is people like standards bodies, so ISO or the IEEE, for example, or the British Standards, BSI, British Standards Institute. I think that's what the I stands for. They will then do the work of defining at a technical level, right, what is appropriate. And then you have certification bodies, which will say, their role will be to assess whether what a particular business is doing actually meets the standard as a kind of external, as an external validation. And I guess businesses are involved in all of those levels. So I was actually on a call with the BSI the other day talking to actors in the ecosystem about how you would actually go about defining some of these standards in an AI context. If you were to define things like metrics to say, the system must have an accuracy score of X, or it must not display bias between subgroups in a population of more than Y. Like, it's that level of getting into the detail of saying, this is how you calculate bias on a system, and it will give you a score that looks like that. And then maybe as a business you can say, we think a high score is unacceptable, or you can then define as a business what you actually want to implement.
Yeah, and then and of course the decision there is also a little bit about the impact of not adhering to the regulation. How big is the fine, or how much trouble do we get in, and how does that correlate to the commercial loss or gain that you can get by doing something? And that's, I guess, that's why policy and policymakers and regulators need the teeth to be able to implement action off the back of not following it essentially.
Yeah, I think there's also a challenge around, you mentioned it, I think right at the opposite, at the top of the conversation, the pace at which some of this stuff moves.
Mm.
And what can happen, I think, is that businesses can go off and invent some interesting new product or service or way of doing something. And that becomes the de facto way. It's adopted by industry and it becomes the sort of industry standard.
Mm.
Without necessarily the clarity about how that relates back to the actual rules in force. And right, like you were just saying, unless the regulators have the ability to then rein in what's already happening, businesses will kind of just go off and create their own create their own ways of doing things. And in some cases that might be perfectly valid. I mean, there are industry self-regulatory bodies. There's an example in the Advertising Standards Agency. So that's a self-regulation. It's not on a statutory footing. Businesses voluntarily kind of adhere to the codes that the Advertising Standards Agency puts out,
right,
and it allows the market to then correct for that. So if you're an advertiser and you're not adhering to the ASA, then you probably struggle to get airtime on on a TV or a radio show, because the TV or radio show isn't confident that what you're doing is meeting the right standard.
Yeah.
So there are lots of different approaches to it. It's not always defined by kind of governments and legislation.
There's a couple of things that pop out in my head there. One about, I'm gonna come back to this idea of sort of of innovation outpacing policy, and whether there's this sort of cat and mouse the whole time. But I'll come back to that in a sec, because the other one, sort of I think is more important to talk about, is how you go about implementing this change, because technology does this approach of start small, minimum viable product, test it in the market, see if it bites, see if they can attract attention, see if customers like it, and then scale accordingly. Sort of feels like you might not be able to do that with regulation, or more of the question is, can you roll out, can you test, can you proactively go to companies and say, look, this is the regulation, let's implement it, let's test, let's get feedback, and we'll adjust it? Or is it much more of an academic discussion about smart people thinking through all the different scenarios of what might happen, and who cares, and what will the lawyers say, and how customers interact, and how citizens care, and then publish it? How does that work? My naive, uneducated brain doesn't know how that works.
So to take an example from the ICO, you might have, so you've got the GDPR, that's your legislation, that's your starting point when you're a regulator. As a regulator, you'll then produce guidance, and the guidance will generally be worded in terms of what you must do as a business. So if you must do something, then if you're not doing it, that's a problem for compliance. And it will also be worded in terms of things you should do or could do, and may do. So the guidance is supposed to tell you, these are the things that you absolutely must do. And then there may be some other things that are slightly more optional, but maybe represent best practice. And the businesses will then be able to kind of look at the guidance and say, okay, well, we must ensure we're doing the minimum, and then we can do some of these other things as well. And in the process of producing that guidance, the ICO will often do consultations. So there'll be formal and informal conversations with the stakeholders who are affected. So that might be convening roundtables, or it might be taking written consultation through the website, that kind of stuff. So there is a process before the guidance is final of taking feedback on it. And then once it's final, there is a process. I hesitate to call it iteration because it's much slower than you might think of when you think of iteration in a kind of tech context.
Yeah.
Once the guidance is out there and the legislation is out there, you then have businesses adopting some practice, and often you then have the courts. We haven't really talked about the courts as an actor as yet, but you will have people who think that a company is doing something wrong or illegal, and they'll bring a challenge. They'll bring a legal challenge. There are examples of class action type challenges against big tech companies, for example. There was a case brought by a campaigner called Richard Lloyd a couple of years ago against Google. He thought that the way that Google was collecting data on iPhone users was illegal, and brought a challenge, and it worked its way all the way up through the courts. And actually, those court decisions are almost like iteration, because when companies look at the court judgment, they say, right, okay, so the judges have interpreted this particular practice in this way, or they've defined this particular practice in that way. And they
Right.
can then adjust with the help of their lawyers. They can then adjust their practices to make sure that, they're not falling foul and potentially risking a court challenge to what they're doing. So that they're not only, you mentioned fines and kind of regulatory interventions, but they're also the courts as an important source of,
Yeah.
I guess, enforcement, not in the sense of regulatory enforcement, but in the sense of enforcing the law.
And it gives a benchmark, precedent about what is and isn't acceptable, even if you don't change, even if the policy isn't, the wording isn't changed, the clauses aren't changed. You've got some case history that says this is okay, this isn't, this is the right interpretation, this is the wrong interpretation. Yeah, I like the look of that. The sound of sort of the idea that that is essentially iteration. It's kind of clarifying and iterating on what right and what is right and wrong. And then I suppose there's like big changes, over time. There's kind of like updates to it, and GDPR 2.0 might be coming before I know, and that might include all of these things that have been learned through case law, through class action, through feedback, and these sorts of things.
Yeah, and I mean, legislation does have review periods built in. The GDPR does. I now can't remember off the top of my head whether it's every 2 years or every 5 years. I think there was definitely a review of GDPR in 2020, and there was a European Commission report which drew on things like not just court judgments, because there had been some European Court of Justice judgments, but also business feedback as well. If some elements of the regulation are particularly tricky, there are opportunities to kind of update those. Again, a 2-year or 5-year review period is not the sort of timescale that you'd iterate on if you're developing a tech product. They tend to be much shorter. But there is scope for iteration, and also lots of legislation now has sunset clauses. So, this will expire in X number of years or whatever, unless the legislature does some proactive action to keep it on the books.
Gotcha. We may have answered this question now, actually, but this idea of how policy and guardrails can keep up with a space in like technology where it's innovating quite so quickly. And we may have just answered that by talking about this sort of iterative, more slow iteration of updates. But yeah, is there a angst or about being out innovated, the policymakers being out innovated by these new things, new people, new technologies, new platforms, new ways of implementing existing technology that in ways people haven't thought of before?
So I can think of two ways to answer that. So the first one is that there is a lot of interest in the regulatory community about bringing that innovation and iteration into a context that the regulators can kind of observe it. So some of the regulators, I know the ICO does, the Financial Conduct Authority does as well. They have these things called a regulatory sandbox. Okay. And the idea is that if you, as a business, if you have an application of a technology that you think might be close to the line in terms of what's allowed or in a gray area, you can bring it into the sandbox. And that allows you to work with regulators in a very kind of collaborative way. And actually the ICO, I'm pretty sure the FCA would do this as well, but the ICO publishes these sandbox reports. So you can actually go online and look at how the sandbox worked in that particular context. So to give an example, there was a proposal to implement facial recognition in airports. I think it was Heathrow. And this was partly for kind of security, but also for things like queue counting. So if you can detect by using facial recognition or person recognition on CCTV that there's a long queue in one place, you might be able to sort of shift your resources around to just kind of manage the flow of people. And there was a sandbox report which was published and which discussed, what are the data protection implications, what sorts of notice and signage might you have to have if you were considering using a system like that. And that allows the ICO to form a view on an emerging technology in a way that is kind of a bit more controlled. And it also allows other companies to learn from, so for example, if another organization was thinking of doing something similar, they could look at that report and say, oh, well, in that circumstance, the ICO said, as long as you do these things, we think that's broadly okay. Or, we don't see significant risks to individuals if you do those things in this way. So I think the regulatory sandboxes are a good way of bringing some of that innovation into a space where the regulators are almost involved in it,
Mm.
and able to kind of give feedback on it. And then I guess there's also a point which I heard this story a couple of days ago in the context, completely different context, of the financial crisis and the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers, where
Right.
they were talking about capital rules and a very intricate system that the bank had designed essentially to avoid those, where there was an automated system that was buying and selling an asset between two subsidiaries of the bank. So one would sell it to the other, immediately the other would sell it back. And this thing just went on and on and on a loop, basically forever.
Right.
And you do have, again, courts and judges who then are presented with this and they say, I mean, it's completely fictional what you're doing here, and you're clearly doing this just to get around capital requirements. So we're going to intervene as the courts and say, hang on, you can't do that. That's not acceptable.
Right.
So I think where there are examples of fairly egregious attempts to just kind of work around the framework of the guardrails and the sort of the policy constraints on something, I think there are circuit breakers in the form of the courts, for example, in the form of regulators who can then come in and say, actually, look, what you're doing that's just not in line with the rules.
Mm.
And there is a debate there about if we think that the thing that is not in line with the rules is actually really useful and we want it to be in line with the rules, then that's a separate question for Parliament to do things like update the legislation and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's working with it's one of the things I've learned, actually. This isn't about there's a police force over here waiting to get you. It's much more about, as you say, that there's a positive intent with all of this, and if you can collaborate with the people that have that positive intent, that becomes a sort of internal cultural and ethical decision to make for organizations about how they do that. JD Sports very publicly announced the data breach that they may have had, and contact, very publicly, PR exercise almost, to kind of get on the front foot once they learn about it. And if you do these things publicly, you're open, you're honest, you're trustworthy, you collaborate with the right people, then things are going to go wrong. But if you're doing that, if that's an accident, and you're doing the right things to try and prevent those accidents and put the new guardrails in place if those things happen, you're in a space where you're always trying to get better, rather than just trying to kind of fend off the regulator, or fend off getting into trouble.
Yeah, and I think it kind of depends on the stance that you want to take as a business, and like you say, your own business culture as well. And I think that's a really important angle of it that maybe we haven't touched on enough yet. But the idea that so businesses are involved in the process, either through formal things like consultation or informal meetings. And at the ICO, I had plenty of meetings with companies where we talked about challenges, opportunities, that sort of thing. And we're all human, so we're all kind of absorbing ideas all the time and bouncing ideas off each other and creating things in that way. So I think there are opportunities for businesses to say, look, this isn't gonna work for us, or if you tweak it like this, it'll make it easier for us to implement, and then take a very kind of proactive approach in how they actually behave. So like the JD example, which I hadn't seen, but yeah.
It's sort of an angle we haven't really explored, and maybe we'll just wrap up with this, is the kind of the citizen. So we talked about the impact on society. Society is made up of citizens. And anecdotal life of children, they use TikTok and all this sort of tech, and they sign up to things, and they drop things, and they share things, and they're just sort of like living, right? And living, and today is with technology. Does citizens, it's obviously a very general question, and it depends, but do you think citizens care in a way that is, they're proactively trying to do something that does protect themselves, or actually is there much more we society needs to do to make sure it's comfortable and confident in its interaction and its relationship with technology, in terms of sort of policy and what is right and wrong?
Yeah, that's a huge question. It's it's playing out at the moment a little bit, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So if we think back to 2018 GDPR, there's a paradigm in there about kind of regulating data and organizations collecting it and using it. There are lots of principles in there around things like consent or purpose limitation, legitimate interest, and making sure that if you're using data, it's for a quote unquote legitimate purpose. So I think there was a paradigm back in 2018 with the kind of regulating the data. And I think now we're starting to think a bit more. So for example, in the online safety bill, about outcomes. So it's not just about the data you collect. Obviously, you have to follow all the rules in GDPR about collecting and using the data. But actually, with the online safety bill, what I think we're trying to get towards is thinking much more about the impact or the outcomes for individuals. So if I see a piece of content on a social media platform that is harmful, offensive, etc., and that platform is promoting that content through their algorithms that sort of surface content on my newsfeed, the online safety bill is trying to get at how we should deal with that sort of problem. So for stuff that's illegal, obviously, there's legal restrictions already on things like hate speech or ads for counterfeit goods and that kind of thing. But this is a much trickier problem, which is around stuff which is harmful but still legal. So content about self-harm or extreme diets or that sort of thing, which can have a really negative impact on an individual, particularly an individual who is for whatever reason more susceptible to being influenced by that sort of content. So I think there's a real shift in the way that we're trying to think about what's the impact on the individual, as opposed to just thinking about regulating data. And I think what that means is that we're moving away from just saying to people, oh, here's a pop-up that tells you that we're going to collect data about you or use cookies, just click accept and it'll be fine. Much more to what's the impact on you of interacting with these, in that example, kind of the platforms and the newsfeed and the kind of content that you're being served.
Almost like a health warning, like you have on sandwiches, back to the food example.
Yeah. And how do there's a real question around like the balance of responsibility. So is it okay to give a health warning and say to the individual, by using this social media site, you might see content that you find, I don't know, offensive, harmful, objectionable, etc. And then allow the individual to just go ahead because, people are just going to click yes, aren't they? They just want to get on social media. Or should we take more of an approach, which is, I think, what's being proposed in some of the online safety debates at the moment, much more responsibility on the platform to say, no, you have a responsibility to remove this content or to stop it from going viral or, whatever the kind of final framing that we end up with is. And in the online safety bill context, there's debates around, holding directors personally liable, as we do in some other sectors, to say, you as a director could face prison time if you're not kind of complying with these requirements.
Yeah, it's sorry for asking such a huge question right at the end, but I in some ways your response has said to me, this isn't really about citizens saying, I want this, I need this, I want this, I feel there's a problem here. It's much more, there is an impact on society of these things, and the machine, the government, the country needs to kind of make sure it's being considerate to the impact these things have, and in the same way we build new products and services and infrastructure, and this is just a different way of making sure it can keep the people safe and well looked after and feeling confident of living its life in the way they want to. And so it's much more about how do we build a pathway for people to be able to enjoy these services and these products and these technologies without the risk of them causing harm.
Yeah, and it comes back to responsibility as well, and like where that responsibility actually lies. And I often use the example of something like a skyscraper. You don't walk in past the front door and have to click accept with a load of fine print that says, I accept the risk that this building might, fall down or whatever. You can walk in confidently and use that infrastructure and know that it's not going to fall down because it's been, the experts, the architects, the builders, the designers have done lots of work to make sure that it's safe, and they followed standards, and they've used, followed best practice. And when that goes wrong, it's a real scandal. And there have been examples of it going wrong.
Yeah.
But it goes wrong relatively rarely for the
Yeah.
number of buildings that there are out there. And actually, as a user of that building, I'm not the one who has to become an expert in the strength of concrete or, the speed of wind in this particular bit of London.
Yeah.
It's the designer of the building who's got to take all that into account. And that's the analogy that sometimes gets used with the kind of social media platforms, moving the responsibility away from the user to kind of read and digest and understand all of this really complex stuff, and putting the responsibility to be more protective onto the platform. It's not a perfect answer, and there's people will say that that's the nanny state, and that people should be free to be exposed to content that's legal. That sort of argument is the kind of flip side of it, but there is definitely a spectrum where you can expect the person providing the service or providing the platform to take a bit more responsibility, which I think is what's being proposed at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, fascinating. Loads more angles off the back of that one. So I'll pull us to a close before we wander into them. But fascinating stuff, and it's not straightforward. It's just not straightforward, is it? And there's such fine lines between right and wrong, and policy and ethics, and ethics and regulation and legal statements and all these things. So I can see how this is such a nuanced space, and at a time when things are changing and innovating all the time, it can create a real kind of angst, I suppose, in people who are interacting with things that require regulation and guardrails. So listen, thank you so much for coming on the show, Mark. It's been fascinating talking to you. Really appreciate you being here.
You're very welcome. Speak to you again soon, I hope.
Yeah, we'll do. And thanks everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed that fascinating chat about societal impact of technology and the role of policy, and listening to Marcus. And we'll catch you again soon.
Thanks very much. Bye.